All right, so now it's time for us to start talking about management tools, things that we can use to help us manage our fishery. We've got a lot of details here, a lot of stuff that you're probably familiar with that you've been using in your sampling. But I'd like to go into some detail so that you know the ins and outs of these different gears. And again, this might be stuff that you already know. So we got a lot of things we're going to talk about here, but this first lecture is going to concentrate simply on sampling gear and getting into some of those details. General breakdown that people use for sampling gear is passive versus active. And just like everything else, there's kind of a continuum, no real clear difference between the two, and it's not always super important whether this is passive or you consider it active, but this is just a way to organize your thinking. And passive, we think of as something that is little effort, in which little effort on your part. The fish sort of catches itself. Think of a gill net, right? The gill net just sits there and the fish just swims into it. Versus active, which is where you have to put more energy in and you're actively trying to catch the fish. Think electrofishing or something like that. So this is sort of just a convenient way to break down gears in order to talk about them. So we'll talk about the passive methods first. The most common ones that we're going to talk about and that you're going to use are gill nets, trammel nets, hoop nets, trap nets, a lot of people call them fyke nets, and also trot lines. Now most of your gill nets are going to be made of monofilament fishing line. Of course, they're just like fishing line, there's different weights, but these are usually heavier monofilaments than you go fishing with a lot of time. Big advantage of monofilament gill net is it's hard to see, and so you catch a lot more fish. But the downside is that it can rip more easily, and so potentially the fish can get away. That doesn't really happen all that much. That may be a good thing. A lot of times you fish in the river and you get snagged. The only way to get most of your net back is for it to rip and to let go. And so those are sort of the trade-offs for monofilament, but most people are going to fish a monofilament gill net just because the catch rates are so high and it is relatively tough. Now you can have nylon gill nets. That's kind of an old school thing. That's more like a string, and so that's going to be a lot stronger. You're not going to rip one of those, but it's easier for the fish to see. So your catch rates are going to go down, and you just don't see a whole lot of nylon gill nets out there. When you're fishing a gill net, there's with all these gears, we're going to talk about the things that you need to know, that you need to report, so that somebody else knows exactly how you fished this gear. And so, of course, mesh size is a biggie, how long the net is and how deep it is, and where it's fished. So did you fish it at the bottom? Did you fish it mid-water? Did you fish it at the surface? And also how it's fished. These are all very important things to understand to know how you fish the gear. Now, so one thing that you really got to pay attention to when you're buying new nets or you're talking about your nets is the difference between bar mesh and stretch mesh. Bar mesh is also called square mesh, and that is one side of the diamond that makes up a mesh. Okay? Whereas stretch mesh is if you grab two non-adjacent knots on that diamond and you stretch it till it's tight, that is going to be the stretch mesh. Clearly, stretch is always going to be larger than the bar mesh. And also, just as clearly, is that when you're specifying what your mesh size is, you got to be clear which one you're using. 2-inch bar mesh is a lot bigger than 2-inch stretch mesh. Well, okay, so I'm confusing myself there for a second. The stretch mesh is always larger for a given net. All right. So a 2-inch bar mesh is going to be a 4-inch stretch mesh. A 1-inch bar is a 2-inch stretch. It's very hard to say. That's what I mean that the stretch is always larger than the bar. All right. Consequently, if you've got a 2-inch bar, that's going to be a 4-inch stretch. That's a much bigger net overall than a 2-inch stretch. Okay, so please don't let me confuse you there. But if you look at this diagram, you can understand what I'm talking about. And this is very important and makes a huge difference in describing the net that you're fishing. The stretch mesh is often used, or is often important, because if you think of a fish kind of forcing itself through there, it's going to stretch that diamond out, and that seems to be a little bit more relevant to the size of the fish that you want to catch. Of course, this is a diagram of a gill net fished on the bottom, and you see a fish caught in a gill net on the left, and also a trammel net on the right. Here's another picture of a catfish wrapped up in a gill net. Usually we're going to fish these things upright, and that means you got a lead line at the bottom, float line at the top. It sits vertically in the water, and it sits at the bottom of the stream. Of course, you can tie floats to it and fish it in mid-water. I've done that before with, for example, like stripers or something in a lake. You know, they're pelagic fish, but they might not be quite at the surface, so we fished them at mid-water, and you could tie heavy floats and no anchors, and that thing is going to fish at the surface. I've done that for things like out at Spring Lake, where the fish are going to be kind of pushed into the top meter of the lake. There's something called a hot shot, which the commercial fishermen have talked about, and that's something that a gill net that's got 2 lead lines, and so it doesn't fish vertically; it fishes horizontally, sitting on the bottom. And this is really good for sturgeon and other things that are fishing on the bottom, right? Imagine this net just laying there in the substrate. They're not going to see it. They're going to root around, and it's very effective. In fact, I think it's probably illegal to fish commercially with a hot shot. Drifting is another way that we can fish a gill net, and that is usually, of course, that's going to be fished at the surface. You can't drift down at the bottom because you're just going to snag on everything. Usually happens anyway with the drift net. This is at the surface. The net is deployed perpendicular to the current, and then one end is held onto at the boat, and the net just drifts. This can be really effective if you drift it through a hole where there's a lot of fish. And this is sort of that twilight zone between, is it active, is it passive? Again, this is what I mean. It doesn't really matter if you consider it active or passive. It is a very effective way of catching fish with a gill net. But of course, as you get a lot of snags, and you can tear up a lot of gear. Now, a trammel net is similar to a gill net, except it's 3 gill nets, all tied together at the top and at the bottom. And the outer panels are a much larger mesh than the inner panel. And usually those outer panels are nylon, and the inner is a traditional monofilament gill net. And so the fish doesn't get gilled so much as it gets bagged. And that's what they're trying to show in this picture here. So the fish kind of goes through one of those bigger meshes on the outer panel, kind of pushes up against the inner gill net. Instead of getting gilled in that net, it sort of pushes through a mesh on the second outer panel, and that just kind of creates this bag, and the fish just gets caught up that way. So that's just a different way of collecting fish. Trammel nets are often fished like a gill net, and these are usually more commonly what you're going to drift when you're drifting nets. Okay, another passive type of net is going to be the hoop net and the trap net, or it's also called the fyke net. Of course, they're very similar. Trap net is just basically a hoop net with a box and a lead on the front. Of course, the hoop nets can also have leads on the front of them. Several different variations. Again, the mesh size is important, how big the hoops are, how big the box is, if you've got a leader, how deep is it, how long is it, and also did you bait or not bait. You can bait these things if you want to draw more fish in. And this is kind of a typical hoop net. You see it's fished with the cod end anchored upstream, and the current basically just holds the hoop open. And if it's not baited, you wonder, well, why does the fish even go in there? Well, they're using it for a current break a lot of times. And so they'll wander into this net just to get out of the current. They can sense a little bit of a break in the flow when they get trapped. You can notice that all these have at least one or two inner throats or an inverted cone, and the fish swims down the cone, and then it's much harder for the fish to swim out of the cone. That's sort of how they get trapped in the what's known as the cod end, which is the far back of the net. And you put a box and a lead on this, then you've got a trap net. And with the trap net, these are often fished perpendicular to the shore with the lead anchored up on the shore. The idea is that the fish like to cruise in the shallows. When they hit that lead, fish will almost always follow structure to deeper water, right? Fish is not going to turn and follow that structure into shallower water. Where's it going to go? It's always going to go and try and go around the obstruction into deeper water. And so that lead leads them down. They swim into the box. They panic. As they swim around in a panicked manner, they tend to work themselves back through the cone into the cod end. And there you have them. Again, this is just a typical trap net. This is a picture of a really effective way to fish those trap nets. They seem to fish best when the surface of the box is right at the water surface or even sticking out a little bit, maybe a little bit below. But if you've got too much slope where that top of that box is well underwater, when the fish follows the lead, they're just going to go right over top of the box. So these are much more effective. If they look like this picture, that tends to be when you get a lot of fish. And another advantage of this is this greatly reduces turtle mortality. And this is true for hoop nets or any other net. If you can fish it with a little bit of the net out of the water, you're going to get turtles, but the turtles can come up and get a gasp of air. And so if you're concerned about that, this will alleviate the turtle mortality. Now, there's something that a lot of agencies have been using lately, which was published not too long ago. It's called the Missouri Catfish Method. And I think Texas uses this, and I know Kentucky uses this, and several other people. And this is basically just a way to use hoop nets that's very effective at sampling catfish in reservoirs. And I think it might work in rivers too, but I know that reservoirs are a popular place where these are fished. And so essentially you take 2 or maybe 3 hoop nets and you tie them together in a series. And so the cod end of one hoop is tied to the lead end of another hoop. So basically you have one long line of hoop nets. I don't necessarily think that tying them together gives you any particular advantage other than you just put a lot of gear and you only have to lift them one time. Couldn't tell you exactly why tying them together helps, but it does just keep them all in one long area. And then this is baited with waste cheese, that processed cheese, and I think that there's companies that takes this cheese and compresses it and dries it out. It kind of becomes like a flake. I've heard of this anyway, I haven't seen it. And so it sits in there and it just kind of slowly rehydrates and those flakes come off and it lasts a lot longer. A lot of people just buy the 5-gallon buckets of waste cheese, which smells horrible, but of course is very attractive to catfish. You have to put some kind of a bag to hold it in, or a PVC holder, because that kind of waste cheese often dissolves pretty quickly, so you need some way to keep it inside the net. The trick here is that the inner throat near the cod end is cinched way down. And I've not seen it, but I've heard it described as it's cinched down so much that you would almost think that a catfish couldn't get through there. But that's the key to this method. because these are fished for 2 or 3 days. So it's not just overnight, they're just left there. And so if you don't constrict that throat, the fish have plenty of time to eventually figure their way to escape out. But by constricting that, they get in and they stay in. Now there are other things that always come into play when you're fishing nets like this, especially if it's breeding season. If you get a right female in there, then you'll get tons of males, right? Because they'll come chasing that female. So I think this method it's a combination of things. You've got a lot of gear in the water. It's in there for a long time. You've got the constriction. You've got the baiting. You've got other catfish. All those conspire to draw in a lot of catfish, and a lot of people have been very satisfied with this method. I myself have never fished this yet, but I've talked to a number of people who've had success with it. Other methods here, trot lines, of course, is just a long line with a bunch of hooks on it. You're going to need to know, what hook size, how many hooks. Most of the time you're limited to 25 hooks. Certainly for recreational anglers you're limited, but a lot of times 25 is kind of a standard number. You want to know what type of hook. Is it an octopus hook, circle hook, a J hook? What bait is used? These you have to be baited. How long the dropper is, the distance between the hooks, the overall length of the trot line. These are all important parameters to understand how this is fished. Often fish on the bottom. Again, you can rig these up with floats to fish mid-water or at the surface. A lot of times people don't think of fishing trot lines at the surface because they think of catfish, which is what you're usually going for, maybe sturgeon, are at the bottom, and that's true. But in a lot of ponds, I've fished trot lines right at the surface. And those catfish, they'll come up to take whatever bait you've got. So they can be fished at the surface. The big advantage is a lot less snagging up there. Just saw a recent paper which is very cool. They make sensors now, and these have been used out in the marine fishery for a while. And the sensor will tell you when the fish was caught or when the bait was stolen. Don't know exactly how. It's probably just some kind of pressure or movement sensor thing. But I just saw where somebody used these on a trot line in freshwater. And each dropper has its own sensor. And so you pull the trot line up, and if you've got a fish, you can see when that fish was caught. If you're missing bait, you can see when that bait was stolen. And that can be some really useful information. This particular paper suggested that most of the fish were caught and the bait was stolen within a very short period of deploying the trot line. Downside of a trot line is similar to some of these other methods is you get gear saturation at some point. There's only so many hooks, or there's only so many places that a fish can get gilled. If you get a lot of fish in a gill net, it lays down. So the longer you fish, your efficiency tends to go down for a lot of these methods. Of course, this is what a trot line looks like. This is a little bit more complicated than the trot lines we use around here. So now let's switch to active methods. And I would like to talk about several of these active methods up to electrofishing. And then we're going to pause, and then we'll do another lecture specifically on electrofishing because it is such a complicated and important way that we sample fish. So let's talk about the other sort of active methods here. You see a lot of them. On the right, we've also got like poison, dynamite. Dynamite still occasionally is used to do deep water sampling in deep reservoirs or in the river. Not as much as used to. Sounds like a lot of fun. But some of these other methods are going to be much more common for you. So if you're pulling a trawl, just as before, you need things like the mesh size, how big is the opening of the trawl, how long are the tow ropes. The length of the tow ropes is important because you need roughly a 7-to-1 ratio between the tow rope length and the trawl depth. So if you're thinking you want to trawl at about 3 meters, you're going to need about 21 meters of rope. That's just kind of a rule of thumb, but that's sort of what you can expect when you're trawling. Of course, if you got very short tow ropes, that trawl is going to fish very high and so on. So this is a generalized picture of a trawl here. This is a top-down view of it. You can see that you've got these wooden boards attached to the tow ropes, which between those and the work with the tension on the tow ropes, and they tend to want to go out. And as they go out, that holds the trawl open. These are called trawl doors in the diagram. Around here we call them otter doors. And then you see that they call it the headline. This is what we call the float line. So the top of the trawl's got floats on it. And what they call the foot rope, we tend to call the lead line. But you get the idea, right? And so this is generally fished near the bottom. And there goes my phone. So excuse me for a second. Okay, sorry about that. Back to the trawl. And I think I've pretty much said everything that I need to say there. Again, the otter doors are what tends to hold the trawl open. There are variations of trawls. One that we've used before is something called the Missouri trawl, and that is a trawl within a trawl. And so you've got this big trawl with a small mesh on the outside, and inside is a larger mesh that's not quite as long and deep as the main trawl. And what this does is this allows the smaller fish to go through that large inner mesh and get caught way in the back of the trawl, and it separates the larger fish from the smaller fish, and this keeps them from eating the smaller fish, and it keeps the smaller fish from, it helps to keep them from being beaten up in the trawl, I believe. Another active method here is the beach seine, which we'll tend to call a minnow seine. Basically, again, you need to know your mesh size, how long and how deep the seine is. And this is just a typical minnow seine. Much more effective method is to use a bag seine. So you get that bag in the back. Seems to work a lot better just because, especially when you're working somewhere and you get snagged. And as you're working out the snag, it's much harder for the fish to escape because they tend to go and they like to just hang out in that bag. So a bag is almost always a better choice than just a straight seine. A purse seine, this is something that's used in marine fisheries quite a bit, but it's been attempted on the river in larger reservoirs. Essentially, it's a big seine, and the bottom of the seine has a drawstring. And so you launch the seine, the net attached to a float, you make a big circle with your boat, come back to the starting point, and then you start to pull in that drawstring, and it's just like the drawstring on a bag. You just pull it, and the bottom cinches up, and then you've basically got a bowl that contains all your fish, and then you just haul the whole thing in. This is an example of a push net. Nothing more, just what it sounds like. It's a net mounted to the front of a boat. You tend to push. It seems that these work pretty well for collecting shad. This is often called a shad scoop. I found this online. This is kind of interesting. A beach push net. You can see it's got little skis there on the bottom of it. And so for sampling smooth, shallow areas where you would normally maybe use just a minnow net, this might be an advantage simply because it only takes one person. A pop net is kind of a cool thing. This is just kind of a trap. It's basically a net that you collapse on the bottom, and then you release a trigger, and the fish pops up, capturing everything inside. So you build these in several different ways. Essentially, it's a net that's anchored to the bottom, and then the top of the net is anchored to, say, a PVC frame or some other kind of frame that's got some buoyancy to it. But the top is pushed down to the bottom. The net's all kind of crunched up. You've got a couple of maybe just hangers or tent stakes or something that holds that down on the bottom. And then there are floats attached to those triggers. And so you set this up, you push it down, You leave it, you let all the fish calm down, you sneak up, you find the float that's attached to your tent stake, you pull it, the tent shoots, the top shoots to the surface, trapping anything inside. Kind of a neat design. Ichthyoplankton tows are going to be active mesh nets that you're going to use to try to get very small larval fish. They can be mounted on the bow like a push net or dragged behind or to the side, catching larval fish. Of course, you need to know mesh size, how big the net is, and how long the net is. You have the same rough rule of thumb of 7-to-1 ratio of the diameter of the opening of the net to the length of the net. And what you're trying to do there is avoid a pressure wave in front of the net that would actually push fish out of the way. So imagine a net that had no, it was just a flat piece of net in a ring. If you pulled it through the water, there'd be a tremendous pressure wave in front, and all small fish would just get pushed out of the way. But if you extend that a long way, then that net just flows through the water better, and there's not as much of a pressure wave, and so you tend to catch more larval fish. Another thing that you really need to know here is the volume of water passing through the net. And so you'll usually mount a flow meter in the mouth of the net. If you know the diameter of the net and you keep accurate record of the speed of the boat and for how long, you should be able to calculate the volume of the water that goes through the net, but nothing beats having a meter right there that tells you exactly how much water goes through the net. So this is just one way that these ichthyoplankton nets can be designed. This is called a bongo sampler. Looks like bongo drums. Here you just see one net on either side of the boat. A lot of variability. Larval fish have a patchy existence, and also a lot of things can potentially go wrong. That can get clogged, flow meter, what can jam up, whatever. So a lot of times when you're doing ichthyoplankton tows, you're doing them in tandem. You're not doing just one net, you're doing two. Okay, so there are also other methods. Light traps come to mind, mini fyke nets. You can go out with a dip net and just try and catch fish that we could talk about, but what we've just now covered are some of the more common ones and what you need to know about them. Next lecture, we're going to get into the most important active method, which is electrofishing, but I want to talk about that in more detail. So I'm going to go ahead and stop now, and then I'll see you again here in a second, and we'll talk electrofishing. So that's it.